As Washington takes office, the first Congress of the United States also begins meeting. They had many problems that faced them when the Articles of Confederation expired, several of which you see here: unpaid clerks, small military, very small, and millions of dollars of debt. In the newly formed government, it took them a while before they came to to New York to begin business. It took them until April of the following year to have a quorum in order to proceed with new business. So they're slow out of the gate and faced a daunting task. As Washington came in, he was inaugurated in New York City April 30th, 1789. Witnesses, as you see here, reported that he looked grave almost to sadness. He expected this to be a very difficult task. He was very burdened by what he faced, knowing that all future presidents would follow his example. He was going to set the precedent for anybody else who would take this job in the future to follow. And he understood the implications of that. His background was in the military or managing a plantation, so he wasn't a politician, did not quite understand what the job entailed, and he had no one that he could ask because no one had ever done it before him. So he thought it was best to surround himself with many advisors, and so he sets forth in creating the first presidential cabinet. However, this would be a very monumental task because who does he get to handle a job that has never existed before? And so he called on many of his relationships that he had built over the years of military leadership, both when they were colonies and during the Revolution. Called on these people from all over the country to help create. At the same time, Congress was meeting and setting up the judicial branch. The executive branch with Washington was underway. Congress and the legislature were meeting, and the first thing they had to do was create a judiciary branch. They passed the Judiciary Act of 1789, calling for the Supreme Court, which would consist of a Chief Justice and 5 associate justices, totaling 6. John Jay was chosen as the first Chief Justice from the state of New York. Washington would appoint 2 other northern state justices, followed by 3 southern state justices, keeping a balance that he knew would be very important to our country. Judiciary also set up a system of districts and circuit courts that would interpret the laws all over the land from this new Constitution. As we mentioned, Washington set up his cabinet. He wanted the best and the brightest around him to help advise him on his job. 1789, Congress creates 5 executive departments, really 3 departments, and then 2 other positions that Washington felt were important. The 3 departments: Department of State, Treasury, and War, and you see there the leaders of each: Thomas Jefferson, Alexander Hamilton, and Henry Knox. As this new government came to be, we began to see some of the big issues that were facing them as they took this job. One of the first ones you see there, a huge debt, $52 million debt that we were facing, which was a huge number for a nation of less than 3 million people. And we had an economy largely based on farming, small farmers, not plantations, but small farmers. So we couldn't necessarily just collect the money and pay the debt off. We had no navy and a very small army, and we had a lot of problems with other nations inside our borders. The Spanish had closed New Orleans. The British were still occupying their forts in the western territories because they refused to leave them, as they had agreed to after the American Revolution. So just like during the Revolution, we turned to some great leaders to help us with that. Of course, Washington becomes president. He's chosen unanimously, the only president to be chosen unanimously by the Electoral College. John Adams becomes the vice president. He was the second leading vote getter. Did not get a single electoral vote, but he did get enough of the popular votes to declare him to be the first vice president. We move into business now. The first thing on their list was reducing the national debt. We had a large national debt, and during the Revolution, the government desperately needed money, so they had to borrow from foreign countries and ordinary citizens through the use of bonds. They would sell these bonds and promise to repay them in the future, and this was seen as a way to get wealthy Americans involved in the revolution going forward. They would invest money just to help because the bond success was tied to the country's success. Therefore, it's an investment to these guys. But many of these bonds were bought up by speculators who took advantage of Americans, and it didn't quite turn out to be the help that it was intended to be. So Congress immediately begins trying to figure out what to do with these bonds, plus the debt that they were burdened with. And the first idea they come up with is to pass a huge tariff, a tax on imported goods. But they couldn't agree on what type of tariff. Did they want a protective tariff? Well, the South said yes. That protective tariff would make it very, very difficult for foreign nations to send their goods to America and sell those in our markets, which would prevent another Shays Rebellion. However, the North opposed a high protective tariff because they were the ones buying these goods, and it would cost them more money to buy goods either from the South or from other nations. The compromise they reached was a small revenue tariff, somewhere between 5 and 8% of almost like a sales tax. So they agreed to this small price, liking of Alexander Hamilton, the Secretary of the Treasury. He puts together a large plan to reduce the federal debt. First of all, he says the federal government needs to assume the debts of all the states and the national debt and pay it off all at one time. This was highly debated. The southern states, some of which had already repaid their debts, protested, saying that they had done their job, they had paid off their debts, so why would they agree to bail out the northern states? Again, highly debated. The second step was chartering a national banking system, another debated topic, but Hamilton believed it was necessary in order to regulate interstate commerce. They had to have a place to put their money that were getting from tariffs and other taxes and things in order to regulate that commerce and to pay back their debts. And the third part of Hamilton's plan was a very high tariff. He did believe in the high tariff, but it was never agreed upon, and so they threw that part out. However, Hamilton says we do need an income source, and so they pass an excise tax on whiskey, and we'll revisit that a little bit later. That does not go over very well. Hamilton saw in his plan, one, it established national financial security. If we're good paying back these debts now, it'll be easier to borrow money in the future if we need it. It also would buy political support from wealthy Americans, as Hamilton pretty much believes it's good to have rich friends. And if we are a country that is welcoming of foreign investments and we repay those investments with returns, it turns out very well for all those involved, both our country and those investors. And it would be profitable for those investors. And Hamilton felt like we should move away from agriculture and toward industry anyway. And so he felt this was a step in that direction. James Madison led the opposition against Hamilton. Just like we said, the southern states had been paying their debts and felt that this was not fair to them. And they also said that if we sell more bonds to repay that debt, it's only going to reward those speculators even more, which would be very, very risky. Instead, if the government actually was able to repay those bonds, the speculators would make a huge profit, and the government would not be helping the majority of their citizens, only a select few. So as they continue to debate this plan, Hamilton relies on the implied powers of the Constitution to get this plan done. Madison and Jefferson, Thomas Jefferson, a fellow member of the president's cabinet, they favored a very strict interpretation of the Constitution, and they're actually shocked that Hamilton would suggest doing something that the federal government doesn't specifically have the power to do. They all believe that a national bank would benefit the North more than the South. It would also benefit the entire country to a degree, but mostly the North. They also believed that an industrial economy created greater inequality. They saw farming as a way that any American could start their own business and control their costs and actually move their way up the socioeconomic ladder, whereas industrial jobs did not do that. And so the debate back and forth about the banking system, about the tariffs, about the bonds, and they come to a compromise plan. So that compromise was The South wanted the future nation's capital, to be built in the southern states. So Hamilton offers them to do that. They want to move the capital to Maryland, Virginia area. They create Washington, D.C. to do so, and they agree to start the national bank and to impose the excise tax. The National Bank is in Philadelphia. There you see a picture of it there. It would be in Washington, D.C. Would not be part of any state, however, so it would not be subject to any state laws. It would be its own district, the District of Columbia. The plans call for it to be ready by 1800. Temporarily, the capital was moved from New York to Philadelphia. Philadelphia, being a city in Pennsylvania, which was very rural, was a temporary compromise for those farmers. Speaking of those farmers, we've mentioned that there was an excise tax placed on east of the Appalachian Mountains. Grains and corn specifically was very costly to transport to market, and those farmers growing those crops were in high competition with Britain and other farmers to sell the corn and other crops. So it was much more profitable for them to take that corn, distill it into whiskey before selling it. Therefore, it became almost like a currency in the western parts of the country. Western farmers saw Hamilton's excise tax as a direct attack on them, and they weren't happy about it. It's the Whiskey Rebellion. The anti-tax sentiment was very strong in Pennsylvania, and so the opposition there would take things to extremes. They would burn the barns of the neighbors who were telling the tax collectors about them, and this situation very much mirrors Shays' Rebellion from several years back. The only difference in this situation was the outcome. In both scenarios, you had farmers who were upset that the government is either too active or not active enough. Either way, it hurts the farmers. And so they react. During Shays' Rebellion, however, there was no central government that could step up and put this rebellion down. During the Whiskey Rebellion, Washington, along with Hamilton, would personally escort 12,000 troops into Pennsylvania when the governor failed to step up and stop the rebellion. They go in, 20 leaders are captured, 2 found guilty of treason, but Washington pardons these guys. Why does he pardon these guys? Well, he wanted to send the message that the federal government would act on certain crimes. They had the power and they weren't afraid to use it. And so he sends a message. He extends grace this time, but don't cross him the next time. One of the things we also see with the Whiskey Rebellion is it shows us just how passionate and divided our country was. And so we're going to see the birth of political parties come about, and that's what Section 2 of Chapter 8, as we mentioned, it shows just how different people's opinions were, and you can see the traditions of our country. We go from committees of correspondence back pre-revolution to the Sons of Liberty with the Boston Tea Party, the Federalists and Anti-Federalists as they debated the Constitution, and then finally we get to different ways. The framers tried to avoid these parties altogether. They saw them as a threat to a republic and the government that would be sustaining. But we get the Federalists, led by Hamilton and John Adams, supported by the northern states and their merchant industrial economy, and the Republicans, led by Jefferson and Madison from Virginia. Southerners supported them because they believed the economy should be based on agriculture. And they had a lot of growing support because many believed that offered more social mobility, including immigrants. And we'll get to that point a little bit later. But that's going to wrap up Chapter 8, Sections 1 and 2 about the first steps of office leading into the birth of political parties.